Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mahesh Das, and I have the pleasure and privilege of serving as the 8th president of the Boston Architectural College. And we are gathered this evening to remember, reflect on the extraordinary, influential, and impactful work of Yu Kongjian and what it means as we move forward. And this was originally, we envisioned this evening as a conversation between Professor Yu Kongjian and Professor Charles Waldheim. And when the news of his passing hit us, it was just unbelievable that we learned. So everything changed. Everything changed that moment. And I would say we're still in disbelief because his voice seems to be echoing everywhere you turn. His ideas seem to permeate all the conversations. And so, yeah, that's. I hope that we can utilize this moment and the opportunity of the exhibition that we have here, and to think about what it means to us. Now, I was just talking to colleagues and friends here earlier about in ancient Indian wisdom as well as Chinese wisdom, the universe comprises of either 4 or 5 elements. In India, it is 5 elements. In China, it is 4 elements. It's earth, water, fire, air, and space. Right? That these are the 5 elements that need to be brought into certain harmony and balance. And a conversation between these elements is the dance of the universe. And in the work of Yu Kongjian, what we see is going back to the first principles, right? His genius was that he took us back to the first principles of asking some basic, simple, fundamental questions that then led us in a direction that fundamentally challenged notions of how we work with these 5 elements in our world. And it is really what is powerful about the moment and the place and the time is when Yu Kongjian was a student at Harvard GSD, that was when a lot of these ideas took birth. So in Boston, and then he went back to China and then took these ideas around the world, and the scale at which he worked was staggering till the moment his life was cut short, unfortunately. And the impact of what he has done in hundreds of cities worldwide and thousands of projects worldwide, that is, I think, is just breathtaking. He was on a mission. And I think this evening we can continue that conversation, I hope, that he kindled, he started, and that we have this opportunity here. So I would like to now introduce Professor Yufan Gao, our own, from our own School of Landscape Architecture. And Professor Gao earned her Master of Landscape Architecture from Harvard GSD and a Bachelor in Textile from Hong Kong Polytechnic University and Cornell University. Before co-founding her own practice studio, Gao Bune, she worked with Michael Van Valkenburg Associates and Mi-Kyung Kim Design. Her studio explores the subtle relationships between nature and non-nature, between landscape and architecture, and the quiet traces of time that give meaning to place. She worked closely with Professor Yu Kongjian on the design of this exhibition that she curated, and her insight tonight helps us reflect not only on his legacy, but also on how one might carry forward with his vision of balance, of ecological grace, and of cities that live in rhythm with the earth. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yufan Gao.
Yufan's there. What is Yufan even doing there?
Oh, that sounds like my son. I hope it's not. He's watching on Zoom. Can anyone mute him? Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that very generous introduction, President Das, and thank you all for being here this evening. We're gathered here to celebrate the remarkable life and presence of Professor Kongjian Yu, a non-parallel presence in the field of landscape architecture, whose impact and loss are greatly, deeply felt by his family, his friends, and all of us who came to know him through his extraordinary work and presence. Those who met Professor Yu will always remember his smile, so generous, warm, capacious that it seemed they can fill the room. I know behind this smile was always a promise of kindness, of support, of collaboration, of trust. It was this smile he gave when I asked whether an exhibition of his work might be possible. And it was also this smile that became a fuel and a catalyst for ideas and inspiration from our first to our last conversation. Selector.
It's just
It's not immediately obvious until you saw how he worked was that the smile was also a great combination, a mark of a combination of humility and confidence. So this very precious pair of qualities was rooted in his tireless search for new ideas and also ways of bringing those ideas together. From his fieldwork photographs to his sketches, his mind relentlessly searched for new ideas, asking questions, and looking for solutions. How might water heal a landscape scarred by waste? How might people and water meet? How might a city learn to live with water, turning storm and flood into gestures of renewal? They invite us to think what it means to coexist. As I work with him on his project and listen to his colleagues and students speak of his legacy, his influence, his pedagogy, and as I visit his project in Beijing and across China, what struck me most was not just this wide recognition and impressive skill of his project, but how we live in those landscapes. The vivid ways people inhabit them, how ordinary life unfolds within them and alongside them, how beauty, rest, and play emerge from functionality, how productivity becomes an attractive form of presence, how the mundane act of the everyday animate landscape with life. So to create an exhibition that does justice to Professor Kongjian Yu's productive decades of design, advocacy, and ecological vision, we turn our eyes to the rich juxtaposition of form and the spectacular pattern in this project. But not only that, we want to linger before the reflection of landscapes, those that carried our collective life, our memory, and our survival. We want to bring to light the moments and possibilities beyond the spontaneity solved and recognized from an aerial perspective. where vast ecological strategies are understood not only as infrastructure, but also lived, intimate experiences. This exhibition started with people and how they find themselves in landscapes. Children may not yet understand or appreciate that those crater-shaped islands regulate floods, cleanse runoff, and carry the memory of ancient cosmology. But they feel the shallow water against their legs, hear laughter ripple faster than a current, and listen to the pitter-patter of their feet running into that flow. The small joys that root their earliest memories in the river alive. A boy may not realize at this moment that the floating forest once held coal ash and fish pond now remain to capture floods, cleanse water, and bring life back to the Yangtze floodplain. But he remembered the forest as a place to study beside his mother. Among trees arise from water, a closeness that may one day deepen into care. The elderly may not recognize that these ponds and terraces shaped by ancient farming wisdom now hold floods, clean stormwater, and restore life to a once degraded wetland. But they cherish the musky smell of earth after rain, the comfort of sitting beneath banyan with his friends, a return to the landscape that has always carried them. A walker may not yet see those sculpted landforms invite tides to return, shield mangroves from storm, and restore a river once lost beneath concrete. But he knows the peace of a shaded overlook, a place to linger without concern, and the quiet joy of belonging. It's through Kongjian Yu and Churenscape's emphasis on the beauty of the ordinary that this exhibition takes place. A field of small cubes, each carrying fragments of Churenscape's project, where landscape unfold at once as infrastructure and as intimate spaces of daily life. Gather our attention and guides our movement. Land. In 2020, during a commencement speech at Peking University, Professor Yu said, 窗外不远处，雨天的田埂上，正蹒跚地走过一群人。他们赤着脚，披戴着雨衣，挑着沉重的担子，正在为这稻田插秧。透过我模糊的双眼，我似乎看到了人群中我的父亲和母亲。Kongjian Yu always returned to the memory of his rural being in Dongyu village, where white sand creek and 36 weirs shape both land and life in cycle of flood and drought. He grew up among ponds and wetland, natural infrastructure that sustain communities and buffer water's force. But this landscape was gradually yet swiftly mauled by rigid engineering that not only worsened flooding, but also kicked people out. Out of this experience, he shaped an alternative vision grounded in a belief that landscape must be designed as living, adaptable systems rather than static ornamental compositions. This vision gives form to the exhibition you see in our gallery. Vast agricultural lands are shaped by simple tools. Churenscape takes these gestures, humble yet transformative, and connect people with the ground, beneath their feet, and with water that shape the land. As Truanscape imagined landscape as a choreography of production and attention, this exhibition reimagined the interior space as a landscape in itself, one that invites visitors to find meanings in simple gestures, to bend down, look closely, and linger a while. It draws from the spatial characters and seasonalities of Kongjian Yu's agricultural fields and activate the gallery's architectural elements, benches, walls, mezzanine, to echo the multidimensional experience in Kongjian Yu's landscapes. To move through the space as one might traverse a field, to touch the ground as one might tend the land, to see through the body. Yet, field. During his last commencement speech this past June, Professor Yu said, "You see the land in its true form, breathing the scent of water, hear the sigh of an ordinary farmer, and feel the warmth of the grassroots. It's with the unfiltered intuition, with experience and the body itself, that you measure the reality of a place." Professor Yu always urged students not to trap themselves in offices, in air-conditioned cars, or in reports. Go outside, ask villagers what they hope for, and breathe in the scent of the soil. Professor Yu always calls himself a rural pumpkin, grounding design and wisdom of the land rather than the vanity of the elite aesthetics. A designer and a dreamer who always walk from the field to the classroom. When I visit his office, my eyes were drawn to the shelves upon shelves of photo albums from his decades of field work. They were stunning. I asked him if he had ever exhibited any of them. "No, can they be?" He asked. "Yes, of course, you will see how incredible they are in our gallery." It is with deep sadness that when I think about that promise. Professor Yu helped me gather his photographs from across regions of China. He spoke about his design inspiration, the timeless interdependence of culture and nature, most obvious in the bound between farmers and their farmlands. He fixed his focus on people even more than on the landscapes. He understood that landscapes live in us as much as we live in them. His practice, his perspective, his techniques were response to the call of long traditions of those people who inhabit the landscape he continues to inhabit. Whether to cut and fill, to irrigate and fertilize, to frame and access, grow and harvest, or to recycle and save. The principle guiding his aesthetics were inscribed into his emotions and imagination through his travels across China. His vast library of extraordinary photographs was both his research and his testimony. If his photographs record how he saw the land, his writings reveal how he thought through it. Amid his prolific body of writings that accompany his design work, several stands as touchstones of his philosophy. Return to the land, in the name of the land, the ideal landscapes, the culture being ignored, and the beauty of weeds. Each review his deep affection for the land and life's most genuine forms. From this writing emerged what he called the big feet aesthetics. a vision of beauty found in ordinary and function rather than ornament, embodied in the beauty of the ordinary, the beauty of minimal intervention, and the beauty of productivity. In Zhongshan Shipyard Park, there's a simplicity in the transformation, so much so that major moves feel like light touches. An abandoned shipyard is transformed into a living park by honoring what remains: rusted machinery, weathered concrete, and spontaneous grasses. Minimal design like nature held the scars and creates a quiet yet powerful space of memory and resilience. Tongtoshan Archaeological Park, at the site of China's earliest city and first cultivated rice field, the archaeological core stands, surrounded by light interventions. Seasonal rice cultivation, restored wetland, and shaded paths reconnect visitors to ancient traditions. But the glass bridge offers views without disturbing the ground. In Churenscape's design, productivity gives rhythm to the landscape and shows the melody of its inhabitants. At Shenyang Architectural University, agriculture is reintroduced into urban and institutional settings. Rice paddies, lotus ponds, and vegetable fields replace lawn, merging education with cultivation, and showing that beauty lies in what's functional, edible, and native. They become both a mediator and a setting. Shui, water. Professor Yu recognized that the climate crisis is a water crisis. In response to the limit of carbon-intensive gray infrastructure, he proposed a land-based, water-driven solution rooted in both traditional wisdom and ecological science. What he first called the sponge city and later the sponge planet. At its core, there are three principles: retain water, slow down flow, and embrace water. At Benjikiti Forest Park in Bangkok, form as flow draws us to the landscapes. A former tobacco factory was transformed into a 52-hectare wetland that captured millions of cubic waters of monsoon rain. By retaining water where it falls, the park reduced runoff, secure groundwater, and provide flood resilience, but also creating a habitat and a new public space at the heart of the city. In Haikou Meishe Greenway, 13 kilometers of concrete embankment were replaced with meandering channels, wetlands, and floodplains. The greenery slows and filters stormwater, improve water quality, and reduce flood peak. The city and river became alive with a new rhythm. At Sanya Mangrove Park, a degraded landfill is restored into a tidal wetland that welcomes daily flooding. By embracing water's rhythm, the park protects biodiversity, strengthens the coastal resilience, and offers the city a new commons shaped by tide. The concept of sponge city echoes Taoist philosophy. It follows the natural rhythm of water, allowing it to slow, to seep, and to be retained within the city, overcoming hardness with softness. Also heard is the Confucian philosophy of the benevolent delight in mountains and the wise delight in water. And the principle of traditional feng shui to gather wind and collect qi, to prize above all the presence of water. All reflect a profound understanding of and respectful for the natural environment. In the end, as from the beginning, Kongjian Yu's vision and Turin's space project were and remain about land and people together, 土人, 土 for land and 人 for people, inseparable and interdependent. May you keep the eyes of the ordinary, Professor Yu encouraged this year's graduate. He continued, a body willing to bow down and bend close, and a heart willing to listen to the voice of the land and its people. May you carry this sensitivity and awareness as you measure the mountains and rivers, as you set your ideals in place. Professor Yu showed me a majestic tree he had preserved on the new campus of Peking University's College of Architecture and Landscape. He shaped both the architecture and planning around it. So today, the tree stands at the heart of the campus, bearing witness to his philosophy that the land and its living being should always come first. In the ancient Chinese notion of 土人, the land is not inert matter, but a center of life, imbued with spirit, memory, and renewal. People entrusted with the care of the landscape are called to work in harmony with nature and social process to restore ecological balance and cultural meaning. This is the lifeblood of Professor Yu's work and remain the DNA of Truenscape. Professor Yu continuously emphasized on the importance of acknowledgement. It's my great honor to have the opportunity to know and learn from Professor Yu. I thank him for his trust, Dean Carrie Nelson for her support, and my team, Renato Pineda, Indra Clark, among others, for their dedication. We may not here have the resources of a museum. Everything here was built in our wood shop, handmade by our students. But we understood that our greatest and most indispensable resource was the ability to work together with a shared purpose. In our process, we have tried to honor the spirit and sensibility of Professor Yu and Truenscape. And lastly, for my fellow landscape architects and for all who shape and care for the environment, architects, planners, designers, activists, educators, and students alike, Professor Yu's words from 2019 remain as fresh and wise as he spoke them 6 years ago in a commencement speech. Be a person true to yourself and different from the rest. No matter how powerful and menacing the force of conformity may be, this world offers 100 reasons to change yourself and become someone else, but only one reason to remain true, that the world needs the unique gift that only you can give. 只有一种理由让你忠实于自己，那就是世界需要被给予独特天赋的你。Thank you, Professor Yu, for the vision and imagination that let our shared future take roots in the ground we touch. And thank you all. Thank you, everyone. And now I have the great pleasure of introducing Charles Waldheim. Charles was the chair when I was at the GSD, so what a great honor to share the stage with you. I had originally invited Professor Waldheim and Professor Yu to have a conversation together, so it feels especially moving to be continuing that dialogue in his memory. Charles Waldheim is a North American architect and urbanist based in New York and Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's a John Irving Professor at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he directed the school's Office for Urbanization. Waldheim's research examined the relationship between landscape, ecology, and contemporary urbanism. He's an author, editor, or co-editor of numerous publications on this project, including Landscape as Urbanism, a general theory, a landscape urbanism reader, a technical lens, a critical primer, among many, many all. He's also the recipient of the Rome Prize Fellowship from American Academy in Rome, the Visiting Scholar Research Fellowship at the Canadian Center for Architecture, the Center Fellowship at University of Michigan, and the Cullinan Chair at Rice University. He has been a visiting scholar at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London and Bauhaus in Dessau, Germany. I'm so grateful to have Charles here with me, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Yufan, for that that lovely in memoriam. These field photographs are extraordinary. Thank you for sharing those. They're not very widely circulated, as you know. President Das, Dean Nelson, all of you, thank you all for being here. Let's see, I haven't figured out yet what to do with this. There we are. I should also acknowledge that the photographs of Kongjian are by a photographer, Tai Cole. They were taken in November last year in the field. And they're shared with us courtesy of Ashley Simone and Axiomatic Editions. The photographs of the Turinscape projects are courtesy of Turinscape. Yu Kongjian was a tireless advocate for what we think of as the new art of landscape architecture, and not as an academic concern, but as a means of improving people's lives in tangible and directly material ways. He was a charismatic speaker, a dedicated teacher, and a role model for generations of designers around the world. He leaves a global legacy of consequential works and multiple lasting impacts. He was characteristically kind. You know, Yufan referenced his smile, which was perennial, enormously empathetic, and would embrace any human being that he encountered. He was remarkably funny. He was my friend, as he was a friend to many of you in this room and to countless others around the world who were illuminated by his generous lights. In thinking about what I could say about Kongjian's life and work, what I wanted to begin with, to open with, is to situate that thinking in the context of colleges and universities. Institutions like the Boston Architectural College or Harvard University or Peking University or Beijing Forestry University, and their role in the production and dissemination of knowledge, their role in convening spaces for cross-cultural exchange and the transmission of ideas, and what might be a part of the idea of the Enlightenment Project, something that I think of as being incomplete. We would acknowledge that, of course, there are challenges with modernization. There are challenges, there are problems associated with exchange of culture, associated with the loss of local culture or the erasure of specificity. But I want to start there because I think Yu Kongjian's his personal origins and his professional aspirations illustrate for me, as much as anyone that I've known, the potential for the modern project and the importance of us continuing with that, however incomplete and fraught it might be. His experience illustrates the role of higher education and institutions like these in addressing our contemporary situation. And that's particularly timely at a moment when we are under siege, right? When people would have us close our borders, at a moment when we would be denied visas, at a moment when specifically retreating into the silos of our cultural identities, our national identities, is being enforced. Yu Kongjian was born the second son and third child to peasant parents in a rural farming village in Zhejiang province in eastern China. His birth in 1963 coincided almost precisely with Premier Zhou Enlai's announcement of the 4 modernizations. Among those reforms was the introduction of university admissions via national placement examinations His older brother did not go to university, did not have access to national placement exams in the new style. Another implication of the four modernizations of Zhao Enlai was the return to Beijing in 1979 of Beijing Forestry University's landscape architecture program. That program had been among those exiled to Yunnan province in the southwest of the country in the 1960s in the context of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Yu's abundant intelligence, as evidenced by his national placement exam, placed him into Beijing Forestry University, where he completed both his undergraduate and graduate work. While a student at the newly restored Beijing Forestry University, Yu encountered English language texts on landscape architecture. These included canonical books by Ian McHarg and Richard Foreman, as well as books on urbanism by Kevin Lynch, among others. Given his growing fluency in English, given his native intelligence and his hard work, he was then elevated to be among the top members of his class, and therefore was invited the honor of meeting with and translating the lectures of Professor Carl Steinitz, who was visiting from the Harvard GSD in 1987. At that meeting, Steinitz encouraged Kongjian to apply to the newly minted Doctor of Design degree, first offered in 1986, the year prior at the Harvard GSD. Yu was the first mainland Chinese student to matriculate into the new program, which he entered in 1992. There he worked closely with Steinitz on geospatial planning, with Professor Richard Foreman on landscape ecology, and became a deep reader of game theory. His dissertation on security patterns in landscape planning was defended in 1995. And that work went on to inform his larger scale landscape planning projects over the next several decades. After several years of professional experience working with SWA in California, Yu returned to China in 1997. Upon arrival, he published a pamphlet, Advice to Mayors, printed 500 copies and mailed them to the mayors of the 500 largest cities. This is the level at which Kongjian Yu was operating. That same year, he helped to found the College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at Peking University, where he would serve as dean. And the sequence here is important. Note that he founds the college first before his private consultancy. I think it's not a trivial detail. The following year, in 1998, Yu, again, was precisely of the right generation to benefit from Deng Xiaoping's openings and to experience the new opening to Western-style consultancies, that is, for-profit, fee-for-service design firms. Over the subsequent decade into the aughts, Yu would lecture the Chinese Ministry of Construction's Conference of Mayors, and he ultimately published The Road to Urban Landscape, a dialogue with mayors. So his project was political from the very beginning and operating in a very specific cultural context of the party, but also of the mayors of cities. Unlike in our culture, if you're the mayor of a Chinese town and you're good at it, you'll get a bigger city. It's a little bit like being in the foreign service, like being an ambassador. And this accounts for why, in my experience of doing work in China over many years, the mayors are consistently well-educated, consistently present and available, and doing their best to solve the problems that they're addressed with. Through those initiatives and others, you effectively advocated for a scientifically informed ecological planning agenda across scales, from the site to the nation. And he also built an internationally significant practice through hundreds of projects across China and beyond. Of course, Yu's influence extended well beyond his native China. He was a perennial contributor to professional societies, conferences, and convenings globally. Several of us just saw him a few weeks ago in Nantes, China, for the International Federation of Landscape Architects annual meeting. In that context, he was a singularly effective advocate for the role of landscape in insulating populations from the worst human and natural disasters. Of course, his work was recognized by major international bodies with the highest forms of professional achievement, including none other than the Cornelia Hand Oberlander Prize delivered by the Cultural Landscape Foundation and the Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe Award from IFLA, two of the highest honors in our field in the world. Second, I wanted to say something about the work itself and its contribution to our field, apart from what I've said about him as a person and as a leader. And I thought I would do so with a kind of brief excursion into three projects. They're separated by about a decade each. one from the aughts, one from the teens, one from the 20s. The first you've seen before, this is the Shenyang Jiangsu University campus in Liaoning province, 2003. In 2002, the university had commissioned Turnscape to imagine its campus plan. And this was at a moment when, as Kongjian would tell me, the planners and architects had spent all the money. Quite a number of very powerful buildings were built, quite significant works of architecture at a moment of kind of growing Chinese aspiration for the kind of Western style, kind of fashion forward architecture. And so he was presented with a very tight timeline, very little budget. This was a site, of course, that had seen the erasure of the longstanding wet rice farming practice that characterized this site for millennia. And so in the absence of budget, Kongjian did a kind of sleight of hand. He said, well, you know, the farmers are still right here. They still know how to do this. It's almost free. And he invited the farmers, some of them, back onto campus to build a kind of Western style parterre garden campus in the American fashion, but out of the very rice that had been erased. And this is, I think, yes, it's true, close to the people, feet on the ground, think like a peasant, but there was also a very deft political imagination here. Kongjian was making a very clear political statement, but not rhetorically. It wasn't an editorial in the paper. It wasn't a speech. It was through the medium of landscape architecture. And the ability to operate on those levels for me, when I was first introduced to Kongjian and his work, you know, immediately fascinated me. And that's why we've become friends. And that's why we've spent time working together on various things. In this context, as you know, Yufan has mentioned, which drew upon his own agricultural experiences as a child, the material of the campus, as opposed to being a Western style bourgeois luxury good, is turned into something literally productive. And what's fascinating is that the rice becomes something like the mascot of the university. Right? It's sold in the shop. It's the identity of the sports teams. And I don't know where you all are on having a planting or harvest festival. I don't know. I'm sure there are some students here that just got off the farm and don't want to go back. I don't know about that. But the idea that we would provide the identity for this kind of an institution through the very labor of farming itself, I think is quite fundamental. This notion of a productive landscape and beginning with a return to thinking like a peasant was present in Kongjian's work as early as I've discussed it with him for decades. It was present, but this commission in 2003 really enabled him to instantiate this, I think, for the first time among the works that I'm familiar with. By the end of the aughts, 09, 2010, 2011, Kongjian and his colleagues at Turnscape had the commission for Kunli Stormwater Park in Harbin. You can see here, this is a vast residential development in the context of the boom years of China's urbanization, in which mayors were evaluated for promotion to the next largest town based on the building out of square footage of residential real estate, among other things. This was a new town, 30 million square meters of urban development to accommodate 750,000 new residents in a place that gathers 22 inches of rain annually, almost all of it in the monsoon season. So it's a place that's chronically flooded. And here, what I want to suggest is that we see the emergence not only of thinking like a peasant and thinking like a farmer, but in fact, a new typology of urban park. And that doesn't happen all that often in our field, let's say, right? You know, when you first see this, you might think, well, this is something equivalent to a Central Park. You know, it has its antecedents in the Boston Back Bay Fens or other places. What's going on here is a very, very heavily contaminated wetland site, which is quite toxic, is being set aside and protecting the residents in the nearby residential development. So that development on the edge that you see, the elevated boardwalks that would become a characteristic style of his mature work, begins in these projects to provide some kind of landscape amenity, some form of recreation, some kind of animation. But rather than giving us access to the park in that Olmstedian way, he's protecting us from the park, because the park is in the middle and it's toxic. And he knows if he has 50 years and if it's flooding every year, it will clean itself over time. This is a new typology of urban park, and it's been underreported. He's bringing here not only the species that will thrive, but he's beginning to experiment with pond and dike, this ancient farming practice, right, of scooping the waste of the fish and the crabs from the bottom of the waterway and putting it on top, right, that pond and dike, something that he was always very proud of. Although he was a humble man, he was also very proud. He was proud of the fact that he could build this with 3 machines. Like, what do you mean three? Why are you so happy that it's only 2 machines? This is my lack of literacy, right? I don't understand why this is the most exciting thing to him. In Nantes, France, when I saw him a few weeks ago, he said the park that Yufan showed that was built in Thailand, they built with 2 machines and 100 guys from the army. Didn't take very long. And that is, again, another kind of magic trick, a kind of like with almost nothing. And in part, this is based on this sensibility of not doing everything possible, working with the means that we have, but also incrementally taking whatever site is available, whatever challenge is confronted, and trying to improve the quality of people's lives and to do so at whatever scale is possible. And in this regard, Kongjian was quite nimble in thinking across the scales at which landscape architecture operates. You know, in our Western tradition, our own Carl Steinitz has been embodying the so-called large scale, right, kind of GIS and large scale planning. And there's been a longstanding historic tension between that and the scale of, let's say, design. And in fact, Tourandscape and Kongjian Yu have been able to transcend that distinction in ways that I'll say more about in closing in a minute. A third case, again, about a decade later, 2018, Yuezhou Wetland Park. This is also called Fishtail Park in Nanchang. And in this case, you see the combination of working with peasant materials, a pond and dike strategy, elevated forests, but as one is dealing with increasingly polluted runoff water, the scale of the wetland increases. And as it increases, you begin to see in mature works like this, the full milieu of elevated walkways, wetlands for inundation, working with local plant material, and building out what I describe as a kind of mature phase of design expression. He was, of course, curious, open to reinvention, always changing, but at the same moment, what I'm trying to describe here is a kind of trajectory of thought that begins with going back to first principles, precisely, going back to the first elements and thinking about them in a deeply cultural way. But in that cultural form, finding ways to both improve people's lives while also being self-aware of one's critical position vis-a-vis the political economy, the material conditions of rapid urbanization, and the like. Yu Kongjian, China's most prominent and influential landscape architect on the world stage, was at the forefront of the nation's efforts to mitigate the adverse impacts of rapid urbanization and to adapt to climate change. Yu and his colleagues at Tourandscape built hundreds of experimental landscapes based on scientific evidence of environmental performance across wildly disparate regions and contexts. Those case studies offer for us a menu of strategies and tactics for human adaptation in the face of a rapidly changing climate. In the context of that, Yu was asked by the Environmental Protection Bureau of the State Party to use his method of analysis for the basis of a national ecological security plan. And that concept was adopted by the Ministry of Land Resources and informed the National Ecological Red Line regulations, among other things. The resulting plan in 2008, the National Ecological Security Pattern Plan for China, echoes the methodology and the language of his dissertation almost precisely at a larger scale. It established a framework for ecological urbanization that addressed issues of water management and conservation, soil erosion, biodiversity. The framework outlined an approach described as negative planning in the Steinitzian sense, in which planning processes begin not by identifying sites for development, but by mapping high-risk, valuable sites to be protected. Once those sites had been established, urbanization could proceed within the remaining lower risk regions. These recommendations were subsequently adopted as part of China's development of national regulations under the Beautiful China campaign. And again, another thing which distinguishes Kongjian Yu on the global stage is I don't know of any other landscape architect that is capable of practicing at the continental, the national scale with a rigorous, serious way at the level of policy, while simultaneously delivering improvement to people's lives in a material way at the scale of individual sites. In this regard, you'll notice that maybe the press around his tragic loss has focused primarily on the sponge city concept, which I think is the thing that's gotten most people's attention. I think correctly so. It's quite an important idea. And that's become an influential framework both in China and around the world. Underneath that, Kongjian would often rally against the brittleness, the fragility of Western infrastructure. And so part of what I want to say in this context is we have a long tradition, of course, of going to the university in the West. And I keep asking my friends in East Asia, when will you stop sending your children? Please keep sending them because we need them. And they say, well, it's not like washing machines and cars, but we'll keep coming. We've often thought of that model of, you come to Cambridge, you come to Boston, and we have 54 colleges and universities. But in this instance, it's not just that. It's precisely the formation of, the College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, Peking University, and the training and educating of doctoral candidates and master's candidates, and the explosive growth of the field of landscape architecture in China, which is not just about you, Kongjian, but is about a country that is committed to the notion of the field helping to improve people's lives. In that context, the way that I read Tourandscape's work and what I've tried to illustrate in those 3 brief examples is in fact valuable lessons that can be applied across climate zones across the world, and in particular in the majority world of the global south, where these challenges associated with climate adaptation are quite significant. And it's not that the West doesn't play a role in that knowledge transfer, but ultimately I think that we have to remain committed to the defense of the modernist project, the idea that we will exchange ideas, that we will be able to travel. And in that mobility, whether it's geographic mobility or class mobility or the mobility of ideas, that ultimately we all play a role in maintaining and defending that culture. What I want to say in closing is, again, thank you for being here and sharing our grief. From the inception of Tourandscape in the 1990s until his untimely death, you and his colleagues at Tourandscape produced an extraordinary catalog of these place-based approaches that remain really invaluable material for us going forward. They are direct evidence of what he would refer to as the ancient art of survival. And as we mourn our collective loss, I think that we should remember, I will remember, that we have benefited enormously from knowing him and his exemplary life and works. From his boundless enthusiasm, his relentless optimism, those things will remain with us. And despite our grief, he would encourage us all with his good humor and enthusiasm to persist in this important work. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Waldheim. That was brilliant and tour de force of giving us an overview and insight into an extraordinary life, career, and the works that'll continue to have great legacy and continue to inform us for generations to come. And so I think we may have time for a question or two. Imagine. So the mic is there, so you're welcome to go to the mic and ask the questions, or raise your hand and mic would come to you, one or the other. Yeah, there is another mic here as well.
I'm just gonna go back to my seat. Hi, my name is Ivan, and I'm currently at MIT studying urbanism. So, my question is, so Professor Waldheim, you mentioned Professor Yu is probably the single most influential figure in landscape architecture in China, and one of the landscape critic, my mentor, I talked to, Julia Zerniak, when talking about Professor Yu, she said it's hard to imagine a second landscape architect can achieve the same level of influence, not just in terms of his academic contribution, but also the scale of his practice operates and his integration into the governance and political agenda of the technocratic governance in China. So I'm wondering, like, since he tragically passed away after, I think at the moment when China needs at this, if you will, late development or almost post-development state, when he's needed the most, what are some outlooks, what are some hopes, and what are some new agendas that both of you would offer some insight on in the landscape practice in China and other, yeah, a general question. Thank you.
I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer. I think it's a good question. I think I've thought a lot about it, and I have not written about, nor have I said much about his status within China or within either the party system or, the Michael Sorkin published a book about Kongjian Yu and his letters to the leaders of China a couple of years back that I would recommend you to. Fascinating interview between Ai Weiwei and Yu Kongjian, and it's not clear who's interviewing who, but they were clearly seen as kind of peers. And at one point, they start talking about the planting of rice on the rice campus and there's a kind of political undertone about, well, maybe we should plant something in Tiananmen Square. And Kongjian Yu kind of steers around that. And eventually Ai Weiwei asks him, like, how many of your mayors are in jail? Right. So if you're interested in like the understanding of that from that perspective, that book is really valuable. But from what I try to say, and I hope I said, was the most important landscape architect, Chinese landscape architect, work operating on the world stage, because it's that perception of the reception of his work, the importance of it externally that I can speak to. I don't know, Yufan, if you want to add something more. I mean, as to going forward, the other thing to say, of course, is that we, as we are all products of our time and our context. And at the same moment, the raw ingredients, right? The native intelligence, the access to class and educational mobility through the university, the relentless optimism, the grinding. I never saw him jet lagged. I never saw him in the right time zone. I never saw him jet lagged. I never saw him unhappy. I never saw him cross with it. And so, not to make too much of that, but I think those are the ingredients, and then the context in which they are expressed change all the time. And yes, his work benefited, you could say, from rapid urbanization, but also that urbanization necessitated it. So it's a dialectic, right? The last thing I would say is he would respond to each context that I saw him operating in differently with a kind of sensitivity. And often you mentioned, and often people will describe the scale of things in China, or the number of employees, which is a kind of way that landscape architects measure each other up, or the number of projects, or how many hectares, or whatever. And I never heard him talk about that. He always said the fewer the machines made him happier.
Yes. Hello, thank you for the presentation. Everything was so wonderful and great information, inspiring for the studio and in the future. The gallery in general has so many different aspects that relate back to his design. I was wondering about the paintings on the wall and what those are about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah. So, the idea of the exhibition is to place everything on the ground, right? Because smart cities start at the surface of the ground. So we want the exhibition also place all the actual content on the floor. But I do want to point out some of the wall elements and the figure drawings. As you enter the gallery or when you leave the gallery, you will see a lot of intriguing kind of figure ground drawings. They were actually, so it's like, back to us, we were thinking about if everything is on the ground, what we can do with the walls. So I was looking for inspirations and for things to put on the wall. And then those were from Professor Yu's 1998 book called The Ideal Landscapes. So in the preface, he was saying all the drawings from the book was collected and traced or drawn by himself and then his wife, Qi Jinping. So we collect those drawings, and then project them on the wall. So the book itself was talking about the ideal landscape, the cultural construct of landscapes, and how tracing back to the history of how we learn or how we adapt to the soil, the ground, and the topography, right? So those drawings you see are actually the memorial ground, the burial site for people. And the reason why we choose those drawings was, Professor, you said those were the deepest expression or the fullest expression of those cultural values. And so back in the gallery, you will see a lot of curving waters, those enclosing hills, and also all those protective forms connecting people to the landscape. And I think the reason why I want to put them, why we want to put them on the wall was also because he mentioned something he called, I'm trying to translate, the fractal patterns, means that those patterns repeat themselves from burial ground, those drawings, to villages, and from cities to larger urban planning. So they all repeat the same patterns, the ideal landscape of where they see themselves, where people want to locate their tomb, their burial ground. So it's very interesting to see the repeating pattern across scales. So you see those fractal order of ideal landscape across Chinese landscape. You'll see in the gallery.
Good evening. Thank you both for giving up your evening. Really appreciate it. My question is, clearly in China, there is, you know, the acceptance or the, you know, the clear education, I guess, of the people and of the mayors. You've pointed out many times about the political forces. Is that ever going to happen in the United States where we're able to put a, I'm not saying a rice paddy, but something similar on a campus, or, you know, a landscape that deals with, on the scale that they're talking about, a landscape that deals with the water and stormwater and all that? Again, thank you very much. It was very good, the whole thing.
May I say something about Sponge Planet? Sorry. Hello? May I have a word on Sponge Planet? Hello?
Yeah, why don't you let us take this question and then we'll prompt you. Sound good? We'll get back to you. Yeah, thanks for being here and for your kind words. I mean, of course, enormous cultural and political differences. You know, the single party, system. You will notice that Kongjian is always wearing the party red, right? He's on team. He's signaling. And while that, navigating between, working with mayors in hundreds of towns and building out rapid urbanization and the central party was not always easy for him. It was the cultural and political context that he came from also. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten much more, open-minded about different political and cultural systems. From my point of view, we have to acknowledge, environmental challenges and human rights abuses. And at the same moment, in that culture, healthcare is not always just a luxury good. And there's a level of, empathy and care for the citizenry that I've seen, not just in Kongjian Yu, but in the mayors that I've worked with or in the projects that I've been involved in. And I don't want to overstate that. We have a very different political economy here, of course. But what I think would be the through line and what Kongjian might recommend for us in this context is to work with the situation that we find at hand. And don't be afraid to embrace the very conditions that we have, that in fact, in almost any context, he could find a way of improving people's lives. Sponge City from the cloud. Oh yes, please. Sponge City from the cloud, you're up.
Hello, yes?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I'm from Mexico. We are very important group of scientists and professionals that we formed around Kongjian's visit to Mexico 2019. And since then, we kept in very, very close contact with Kongjian and his team, hoping to start large-scale interventions in Mexico, as he has shown us. We're thinking of a municipality that will become a sponge municipality. Anyway, that's what we're trying to do. But I think that the legacy of Kongjian is so important in global, in his global proposal. No, he very seriously did believe, and so I do, and so many others. I would love to have your opinion that his proposal of a sponge planet is indeed a water-based solution to the climate crisis, and we have in hand a possibility of solving the mistakes we've done at the COP, fixing our attention on carbon when it's water, and restoring the water cycle in the whole planet, which can really help us overcome the crisis. Anyway, we want to make a very strong impact on what Kongjian leaves us, and his proposals on a sponge planet. The day of his death, we wrote to school our thoughts, and we proposed that we should organize an international prize, well-funded, on the sponge planet, to have proposals on sanitation, the ideal sanitation system on a global system, etc. Many different aspects that we can build of what Kongjian was about to do. No, hopefully we will be able to see some of his documentary that he was filming in the Pantanal. So tremendous what happened to him, and the impact of his death is quite amazing. It's happening all over, no? So just let's hope that we can push as fast as with all our strength his concept of sponge planet. Thank you very much. We just send you a little proposal of let's make that planet great.
Thank you for the intervention.
Vote for sponge planet all over.
No, we've promoted you to the podium. Thank you for that. Remarks. I'll give the word to Yufan. I could say two things briefly about that. The first is, in the West, many of us have been advocating for and trying to quantify things. We speak of nature-based solutions and COP targets and IPCC reports and any number of really, really important things. And this was not the way that Kongjian approached the work. Right? He didn't begin only at one scale or say that we need to have the whole system in order to work effectively. He would argue for working at any scale in a fractal way that was available, right? That the sponge concept could apply at the scale of this room, the scale of the city. And in that regard, it was, of course, expressed in a very particular, cultural and political context. It's very different elsewhere, in Mexico, for example. And then the second thing has to do with the relationship between intellectual information or data and our tendency to think in data and quantity, and its lack of ability to persuade people that I think we've learned a lot more about in our culture in recent years.
Well, it's not question, but I have strong things I want to share. Thank you so much. Our school hosts this event. Not long time ago, I stick here, and the speaker says there's more than 10 urbanization projects was built in China, like Manhattan, more than Manhattan, right? So in the past few decades, the project in China is all about development, right? But I'm so happy to see our school host this. He's like a star standing on the land, Chinese land especially. It's stand on the opposite side. Okay, beware our land. The company I work for in China, we went to find a investment project in China, but the whole town is like a poison town. The driver drive our team. His father, mother, auntie, uncle, all dead by cancer. Because that town specifically is produced the sunglasses, Ray-Ban, Gucci, whatever you can mention, the famous brand, right? That's the factory, like a war factory in China. So the land is polluted, poisoned, right, by those project and development. So I feel like the lectures given by our two guests is so inspiring. So thank you so much. And I don't know whether Karen recorded this, right? Although you say the culture, the political, we cannot do that much. But if it's recorded, I would like to, find the channel to post to China because it's really positive. You say it's very hard to persuade people, right? But we can do stuff from the little things, to let the people more be aware about this. Like I understand the government, how they run. You can get the money and support from government if you build a big urbanization, big plan, give them frame for them, right? But it's hard to get the money for just the landscaping. But it had, how great to see he used the soldiers. He made the graceland to landscape.
Machines.
Right? And it's so beautiful. It's like what I learned from the BAC. They build the schools from nothing, right? That kind of things. I think he influenced by Western culture. So how positive is this, Western and Eastern together, school host this event? Thank you. And yeah, that's what my thoughts. Thank you.